Hopefully you've all had brilliant breakouts, lots of chocolate, feeling totally pumped for the last session of the afternoon. My name's Katie Hyson. I'm the Director of Thought Leadership for Business Fights Poverty, and it's my complete fortune to be asked to moderate this final session. We are going to have a look at the transformational partnerships that were actually talked about this morning. So how do businesses and NGOs really work together to move the needle and to make impact? This session will try our hardest to be as practical as possible. So get your pads and pens out. We hope you're going to take lots of notes because you're going to learn things. Yeah. But also get your thinking caps on because we want you to ask lots of questions. This is going to be two-way. If we don't know the answers, we're asking you. So thinking caps on, be active, be part of this. And I'm delighted to be joined today by my four fantastic panelists. So we've got Clive, who's here from Unilever. He's come up through the kind of innovation and R&D and business model innovation space, but also happens to look after their big Transform partnership, which I'm sure might come up later in conversation, maybe. And then we've got Nick. Nick's from Cargill. He actually, Cargill being the sort of big multinational company looking after commodities, but actually lives just up the road and has had probably the shortest journey of all of us today. Feeling smug. But he has also come out of the NGO space and sits at that I guess, the juncture between businesses that have to do work with and talk to NGOs who aren't always necessarily working together and partnering positively. We've then got Mark. Mark has flown in, so forgive the jet lag. He's come over from Care in the States and looks at the social venturing space, but also your background is in sort of procurement and supply chains too. So we, can ask him difficult questions on those too. And then finally, we've got Hina from WWF. She has been partnering and setting up partnerships for your entire CV, I think, Hina. I couldn't find anything else that you did. So HSBC, Sky, Unilever, various others, are all part of her sort of partnership network. So hopefully we've got a lively discussion. Clive, kicking off, first of all, I really want to just know, and I'm going to ask everybody these three questions, and I'm opening up to you guys, so watch it. Clive, why transformational partnerships? Why are they so important between NGOs and the private space, and particularly in light of the SDGs?
Okay, thank you, Katie. So no additional introduction required, so that was extremely extensive, and in case you need to remind you, we've got our names up above us. I think transformational partnerships are critical to the SDGs, but not just the NGO linkage, but the total linkage across all relevant partners. I don't think this audience needs reminding. The SDGs are an urgent agenda. We're behind on many metrics, so the kind of importance is very clear. And the SDGs need solutions at scale. So if I'm asked to define transformational partnerships, I define transformational as at scale. So what we did with Transform, since you name dropped it so conveniently for me, what we did with Transform was to set up with DFID an intent to do partnership differently between public and private partners, with a lot of trust from DFID's side that we knew what we were doing on scale. So we were bringing their money and their expertise together with our scale capability and our expertise to crowd in some additional corporate partners, which we've subsequently done. But more importantly, to support small enterprises in developing countries, so Asia and Africa, to experiment with small grants, to understand whether there was a scalable business model. Importantly, though, with the oversight of corporates who had a chance to bring that to scale and help these organizations think through that route to scale. And I think that early stage understanding of how do I think about scale now rather than when I've got my next grant or my next piece of funding is a really critical aspect. And now we have 40 projects in 11 countries, and we have a couple of ones which are really looking like they're on their way to scale. However, if the definition holds, which is transformative means scaled, we're not where we need to be just yet. So we're still on our way with that.
Learning still to be done.
Yeah.
Nick, your experience doesn't just sit where in Cargill now. What would be your reasoning behind why partnership in the first place, but also transformational partnerships?
Sure. So, I mean, as you mentioned, I moved from the NGO sector partly because the need for change at scale was identified, and working for Oxfam as I was, one of the larger international NGOs, and that organisation saying there's only so much we can do. Look at large multinational corporations, what opportunity, what scale do they have? I joined Cargill, and I think when it was around the time the SDGs were published, and as a company, we embraced them quite readily because we frequently talk about the need for the enabling environments, whether that's filling gaps in market failure or good governance. And there's a recognition that even company size of Cargill operates in 70 countries, has 155,000 employees. Over half of those employees are in the global south. And so when we talk about enabling environment, that's something that we bump into every day. So SDGs is a really helpful way of framing that with stakeholders that we work with. The point where Cargill recognises that, as we've heard repeatedly today, that no one organisation can do it alone. We really do see there's places where we have expertise and can add some value, but then we need support. I think also where there are either business solutions or technology solutions, there's a gap in trust at the moment, and it has been for quite some time. And I think working with partners, particularly those that are credible, have scale, can help bridge some of the questions around trust, because they're looking at a broader set of criteria than business certainly historically might have done, and which we might naturally do if we're thinking about performance over the next 12 weeks or this fiscal year. So I think it's really helpful to ensure that we are thinking about the broadest set of social and environmental criteria that are locally applied to where we're working. So it's an important role.
Thank you. And Mark, taking arguably some sort of philanthropic partnerships through to sort of full-blown social enterprises. Why partnership? Why is it important for the work that you do, but also care as an overarching organisation?
Yeah, I'll answer both from a corporate perspective and an NGO perspective. And I'd say as an NGO, you want the work that you do, like Clive mentioned, obviously you want to do it at scale, and ideally you want to do it in a way that's financially sustainable so that it can be, continue forever. And I think that as an NGO, corporations are great partners to be able to do that, to figure out how do you get what you're doing over the hump to make it profitable, to make it sustainable, so that it can scale and be a larger model. From a corporate perspective, the interest to me in partnering with an NGO is they can do things that are subsidized. So as a corporation, you're limited in the number of activities that you can have. You ultimately have got to deliver profit. And so NGOs are great partners to help do things that need to be subsidized for some time period, to help get them over the hump to the point where they are financially sustainable, they are profitable, and then you can scale them much larger.
Thank you. And Hina, with your extensive knowledge of actually making all those partnerships happen, why for you? Why are NGO and private sector partnerships important?
So I know many of the faces in the room from my work at WWF now, but I was also Oxfam before in a different department to Nick, but a number of programmatic partnership roles as well. So I can span hopefully social and the environmental bit. And that's probably one of the key points I want to pull out through this session, is that I find that when we talk about partnership, we tend to separate out the social and the environmental issues. We think about it, but we don't always know exactly how to bring them together. And if we're going to use the SDGs as a framework to move forward, we need to start bringing the environmental and social aspects of work much more closely together. Some examples of it, but I feel like that's where we really need to scale and focus our energy. I'd also want to point out at this point, transformation is such a odd word to define within our sector and sectors. So even between Oxfam and WWF, the definitions were wildly different. So, and then in between different teams. So maybe that's something we could talk about later. What does transformation mean to people in the room? Because for me, it's around driving on the ground impact, using different points of the value chain, not just where we source, but thinking about engaging consumers, engaging retailers, looking at wider sectors, taking a landscape approach, looking at Paul in the front row there. So that might be something which I think could be interesting for us as a group to think about together.
Thank you, Hina. No one's safe. Hina knows you all. So moving swiftly on, actually, Hina, I'm going to come back to you. What do you? So I've asked each of them to kind of be as quick, sort of on point here as possible.
Okay.
Top three. request. So what would be, in your sort of in your experience, what do you think makes for a transformational partnership, and how do you get there?
Probably risk taking and making sure you have plan Bs, and a shared understanding of what you're trying to achieve, and the business case, I guess. But I'm probably jumping in on my private sector colleagues' point.
Well, the NGO business case. I mean, Mark, do you want to sort of pick that up and add anything to those in terms of how do you make partnerships move from being sort of transactional to something transformative?
Yeah, no, I think like specific partnerships of Cargill and Care have a big partnership. And we've looked at that partnership over the last decade and said what's worked and hasn't worked. And I think three of the things we pick out are, one is what are each other's clear metrics and wins? What Care needs to know, what is it Cargill is getting out of this and what do you care about it? And Cargill needs to know that about Care, right? Second is how do you measure those and stay accountable and stay really on top of, are we hitting the metrics that we need to doing? How are we sharing that with each other? How are we tracking our goals and our progress? And then the third is longevity. Just how are we making a commitment for a longer period of time to really be able to move the needle? Because a lot of the things we're trying to move, obviously, are not going to be things that are going to happen in the next quarter or often even in the next year.
Thank you. And Nick, obviously, you're, as we sort of talked about a bit, and often trying to partner with and create relationships with organisations who are not necessarily pro-business always. What would be your advice, and sort of how do you set up practically? How do you go about setting up partnerships, and why are they important to you?
Sure. Well, I think there's a couple of distinctions for the most critical voices where perhaps they don't necessarily want business to be in the room. Then that's different to some of the partnerships, and certainly the Care partnership that's been described. And there it's about looking at is there any kind of sense of alignment? Where are the sweet spots where we can have a dialogue, and probably the pace and the depth of change is much smaller. Find what you can and move from there. If I think that's a complete counterpoint to the relationship we have with Care, where we've worked together for 50 years on a philanthropic basis, the last 10 of which have been much more programmatic, focused. There's been 3 phases. And all the things that we heard Zahid talk about this morning in terms of alignment, shared purpose, absolutely come into play. And one of the big challenges in terms of the how that we've experienced is you can't take 10 or 50 years to cultivate the next partnership that has, it's one of the most significant ones we have. You can't do that. So how do you get to the relationships piece that Zahid mentioned? And so if I think about last month, we announced with Heifer International Hatching Hope, where we're looking to contribute to improve livelihoods for 100 million people by 2030 through the sustainable production, promotion and consumption of poultry. There, we've employed a slightly different approach alongside a very quick sort of set of terms of reference for what we think we want to do together, the kind of which in the past have sometimes worked and sometimes not that long far down the track, haven't really worked, but maybe limped along. Our business, our animal nutrition business, has spent an awful lot of time working on terms of reference that in the past we'd have spent somewhere between 10 and 12 weeks on. And the business is always saying we've got to go faster. What can we do more? But it's all about how can we work through relationship issues? How can we predict some of the likely unintended consequences, such as within the region I work, working in Kenya, the fact that we could be using an NGO relationship to gain a virtual monopoly in a new marketplace, and that's uncomfortable for them. And in terms of the enabling environment that I mentioned, that's uncomfortable for us because suddenly we find ourselves carrying a role that we're ill-equipped to do. So I think that investment of relationship, it's early days. It was only announced formally last month, but it's on 9 months of really intense working to try and accelerate the relationship piece.
And have you actually built in the relationship lines into the terms of reference?
Yeah, so we heard the importance of that existing at multiple layers of the organisation, and it's making sure that when our business leadership in the Kenya business meet, that they've got Heifer alongside them for part of their strategy agenda, so that they're seeing the same context, as well as then the field staff and folks like myself in corporate affairs, colleagues out of the States, where they're looking at different aspects of funding or relationship.
Amazing. And Clive, obviously, transformational partnerships, it's in the name. But your transformational partnerships that we've talked about so far, Transform, isn't necessarily with it's with DFID. So, I mean, what's your experience and what would be your kind of top 3 learnings?
Great. Yeah, I wanted to drill into the word, basically resonates with all 3 comments, but particularly the word alignment. And I think if I look at my experience of partnerships, ones that have really flown and gone well, alignment has been probably the one thing that you pull out and say, what does that mean? Because it's it's a buzzword. So I think in the case of Transform, it's been very much about, actually, the common theme is that you've got to have alignment at 3 levels between organizations. The top to top has to be absolutely clear, both in terms of business size of the prize and impact size of the prize, and of course those mean different things to different partners. The kind of middle level of where you have a business unit head or a middle manager level, again, the alignment, the relationship needs to be in place there. And then in the field, of course, the allocation of resources, the ability to be agile, the ability to flex what you do in order to continue to deliver towards that big goal ends up being key. And if I have one hobby horse, I think that I always get on with these kind of partnerships when we're trying to form them is, do we understand the size of the prize? Have we all really understood what's going to carry us over those bumps in the road when this gets difficult? Because it will. So I think the example I would give that's probably hottest in my mind is actually not one of the Transform examples, though there are a few of those, but the work we're doing with MasterCard in Kenya is a pilot to look at enabling small retailers to have credit. And so it's a Unilever MasterCard partnership involving a Kenyan bank and the retailer, so that 4-way partnership. And what the retailer gets is access to mobile credit through a mobile app. So the rails, if you like, that MasterCard would call them are provided by the MasterCard capability. We provide buying history to the bank so that the bank can understand the creditworthiness of the retailer. So the retailer goes from only being able to buy what they can afford to buy, only being able to sell what they can afford to buy, to being able to sell as much as they can sell. That's about a 30 to 40% uplift in the sales of these small businesses. So I've not seen many partnerships go at the pace that's gone. We're now about halfway to our 40,000 retailers in Kenya. And the only reason for that pace, I think, is that we all understand the business case, we all understand why we're doing it, and at every level, when it gets difficult, we can refer back to why we're doing it.
Yeah, a 4-way business partnership that's arguably, yes, there's obviously a business case, but for social impact as well.
Yes, so the impact is at the community level. Yeah.
Incredible. Things don't always go right, guys and girls. Warts and all, please, time. I'd like to see your dirty washing, if nothing else. Mark, I'm going to pick on you first. What would be the pitfalls? What should everybody watch out for if they're trying to move the dial in terms of their partnerships? What doesn't work? Any war stories?
I just think that the pitfall is or the thing to avoid would be going in eyes wide open and what's in it for both partners. And in some cases, those capabilities may not be a match. I think it's easy to sometimes jump into things and for whatever reason to get it rolling when you're excited, but to think 3, 5, 10 years down the road and say, are we really going to help each other accomplish the things that we, are a big size of the prize for each of us and are meaningful, and we're going to be, in this for the long haul.
Thank you. Nick?
I think just elaborating further on the point I mentioned earlier around relationships, one of my experiences within Cargill over the last 3 years is we have so many partnerships, and that comes from good intent, wanting to do the right thing through the different businesses, different countries, but actually we need to be more purposeful, and a partnership can't hang on a single relationship, as Clive was saying. And so there's so many where I'm trying to rework something because a key stakeholder either in the business or the partner has left, and others don't see the value, and it doesn't go anywhere. So there's something around just being a lot tighter alignment so that the relationships can flourish.
Clive?
I mean, I think as always, it's a flip side of what works, isn't it? So, the watch-outs are actually the lack of alignment and not being clear. And I think the other time when things have probably not gone well is when we've not been quick to say it's not the right partner or it's not the right project. and then get caught up in, but we need to work together. So kind of the deal fever, as some of the VCs would call it, or just getting carried away into a partnership when actually all of that stuff isn't clear yet. Yeah. So it's a generic statement, but I think we can put our finger on many cases where that lack of clarity ultimately, and the inability to say, actually, let's just change this quickly, actually takes us, expends a lot of energy. Yeah.
Thank you. Hina, I come to you last. What's null?
Okay.
Are you ready?
You're ready. So I just think to Nick's point around focus, that's very important. So especially from the NGO perspective, we're tasked with brokering more and more partnerships, but actually that's not sustainable. And also to be brave enough when a partnership comes to a natural end, to, if you've achieved what you're trying to achieve, being okay to step away. And that was a big learning curve for me. And when I was quite new to the sector, I was always thinking, I failed if we haven't renewed a partnership, we haven't extended it, we haven't secured more funding. But if you've achieved what you set out to achieve, then that should be celebrated. So I think that's one area I'd like to share. So it's boring, but governance from the beginning is so important. Who is involved? What's their role? Racy models, getting all of that done up front does make life easier when there is a problem down the line. So there's a couple of additional points. I don't know if it's for later, but maybe you can skip my go later. So power imbalance between the different actors in partnership. So between the NGO and the company, the natural power usually is with the company. They are the one that is usually supplying the funding for the on-the-ground work. So that automatically creates a power imbalance. And I think if you can out that early on and try to treat each other as equals, I think that can really help with moving things along. A lot of my teams have complained about feeling like they're treated like consultants rather than partnerships. So consultant-client relationships, which that's not what partnerships are meant to be about. So if we can try to be clear about that's not what the relationship is between an NGO and private sector, I think that moves things on more. And then structure. So Oxfam and WWF and many other big NGOs are confederated organisations. We don't have a clear decision-making authority. We have bottom-up strategies as well as top-down. So that makes it really difficult when we're talking to companies to actually broker global partnerships. So if you're talking to me in the UK, I can't agree something in the US for my US colleagues. I have to go through a very convoluted route to make that happen. But for companies to understand that, I think it's good to know that from the off. So that'd be some of my tips.
Taking notes. Fantastic. Thank you very much, everybody. So I'm going to open it up to the audience. Please put your hands up, put your thinking caps on. We want to hear from you. And I'd also like to put back the question that Hina posed at the beginning, which is, what does actually transformational partnership mean to you? Are you any the wiser from this conversation, or indeed today? Or is it still as murky and muddy as before? Any questions? I think we've got... there's a mic coming, but it sounds like you don't need one.
You asked the question, what does transformational partnerships mean to me?
Yep.
And I would like to throw that question back to Clive, because he tied transformational to scale, and I wanted to ask what scale meant to Clive.
That would be a good question to you then, Clive.
A commonly asked question. First of all, to clarify the context, I said it means scale when you're talking about the SDGs, because the agenda is so urgent that the only relevant thing to do is to aim for scale as soon as possible. And in that context, scale means actually it is directly related to the objectives you have within a given project. So it'll mean different things in different projects. So are you delivering something which moves a KPI in an SDG in a meaningful way that actually moves it tangibly towards the target we all have to make a difference in this world? So I'm not going to give you a precise one, because I do believe it's genuinely SDG dependent and project dependent. But if you can't look at it and say, actually, I'm nearer to that SDG in a meaningful way, and also, is it sustainable from, in our case, a business case, then actually you haven't moved the needle and it's not scaling.
I'm glad you put in that last point, because I was a bit concerned that you started to sound like an impact company. NGO. Next question. Lady at the front. There's a mic coming towards you.
Laura Koch told you, how do you measure scale through the SDGs or other metrics?
Thank you.
Tell me which ones you use in Unilever or in your other, the other speakers in the panel.
Okay, this is for all of you then. Down the line, who wants to go first?
I can mention
Okay,
CARE.
go for it,
So I'd say, for CARE, we've got an objective to meaningfully impact 150 million people by 2020. And so for us, we looked at the SDGs and said amongst the sub-SDGs, there were 25 particular factors that we want to ladder to from an impact standpoint. And so I think to me, it's organization by organization. You can ladder to the SDGs, but which things are most meaningful to your organization that you've got the capabilities and resources to help drive. And for us, we had those 25 indicators or sub-SDGs we were going to ladder to towards a North Star goal.
I would add something that's not dissimilar in that we went through an exercise looking at the SDGs and at a corporate level said which resonate most strongly to us, where's the materiality. And at the point when we reached out to pretty much all 17 and went, well, that's not actually helpful. We've gone through a big process over the last 3 years of organising from 75 very devolved, somewhat regionally based businesses to 20 more globally based businesses, and they're hugely different. So what's happening in our ocean transportation business and what's meaningful to their stakeholders, that business is very different to our bioindustrial business that produces adhesives, tarmac, to some of the agricultural crop-based businesses. So it's really about, as you said, it's the digging into what's appropriate, and you see that in some of the reporting the different businesses do, is where they're then nuancing and looking at what goals they need to set for themselves. Our cocoa business has gone through and said, well, the corporate framing is useful to a point. That's the start. Now let's get into what do we need to do for our own 2030 goals. And there are absolute goals around the million farmers, cocoa farmers in West Africa, that we need to improve livelihoods. And livelihoods means a range of sub-points. So they've really drilled down, and others are following that. But for us, there's a maturity, there's a distribution curve of which businesses are further ahead doing that. So that's work we're evolving at the moment. And some of the conversations actually at lunchtime were about how we can accelerate that through work with other partners who've got probably more experience.
Clive, you're nodding.
Yeah. Well, I think just to the opportunity to add a bit of granularity on the kind of business side of it. So the SDGs in our business are often expressed through the purpose of our brands. And we know our brands that have the strongest purpose grow the fastest. So actually we're getting stronger growth from our brands that are really living and breathing their purpose. So making an impact on the brand in terms of fulfilling its purpose is the kind of SDG relevant business metric, but of course the other business metrics are the growth and profitability of that brand and our products.
Hina?
So I find with the SDGs, I find it a little bit tricky to actually shape partnerships directly in this SDG framework, because most of the companies we work with pick 1 or 2 or 5, or they don't pick all of the SDGs. So what we tend to do is take a step back and look at both of our strategic objectives, our strategic plans, and what are our KPIs on both sides, if we're looking at a bilateral arrangement, and then mapping them together and taking that approach with the view that there will be a framework that will feed into and ladder up to the SDGs behind that, because both of our organisations have gone through that process. And then having some clear shared KPIs between our two organisations and focusing on them. So I'm just thinking about Unilever in particular. So their Sustainable Living Plan has a number of KPIs, and whenever I've worked with any Unilever colleagues, we literally get to the point to say which of the KPIs are we feeding this piece of our partnership into. So I find if you could just be really clear and move beyond the SDGs with the faith that everything we do does feed into them, I find that much more practical and easier to report on.
Interesting. Thank you.
It's a different angle. Sorry, it's not quite.
No,
Yeah.
absolutely. Does that give you some food for thought? The gentleman at the front.
Hi, Jake Backus. In the past, a successful outcome was a neat little video of farmers getting more income, children going to school, and Medicare, and that was sort of. But it didn't impact or transform the business. but there is a fantastic trend towards companies being more and then hopefully seeing profit as the reward for serving society well, not the aim and in of itself and bugger the consequences to the environment and society. So my question is it possible for big businesses to be net positive for the environment, society and the economy, and are you looking at that?
And can I throw in an extra bit to that question? Is that cheeky? Which is, can partnerships be that transformation? Can they help nudge that transformation to happen? Nick, do you want to have a go?
Sure. So to your point around net positive, Cargill doesn't have an expression that says that that's what we're aiming for. We have a purpose that says we wish to nourish the world in a safe, responsible and sustainable way. I think one of my personal goals is that we find ways to have sufficient measurement and impact understanding that we can show something towards net positive. It's because you introduced by saying that I spend more time talking to activist members of civil society because we're a large multinational American corporation in many foundational commodities, monocultures, and a range of other areas where there's big questions, and rightly so. And so for me, at the point where we have a materiality and we're clear that the impacts that we have are commensurate, the benefit we bring is commensurate with the impacts, then I think we have a much stronger case to not only to speak to our critics, but also to engage in much more interesting conversations around the further role we can play within society. That there will be other, possibly smaller, more entrepreneurial organisations that will find a way to meet the need, to offer more value, and we will become obsolete. And our business is changing as a consequence for that reason.
Yeah, so the drive. I'll leave Clive to scribbling.
No,
you ready? You ready?
Yeah.
He's ready.
So I think, it's actually a very similar perspective, which is, in Unilever, the purpose is to make sustainable living commonplace. It's quite clear that no one company can do what's required on its own. So I think it is very much a case of each company understanding the impact it can make through its own, it's kind of your own house in order first. So what can you deliver through your core business model? What can you deliver through your operations? But much more importantly now, and I think probably a provocation for this audience, is where are those really game-changing partners who are sufficiently like-minded with the right kind of business activities or access to markets or whatever it takes, or to capital, to really change the game? Because the feedback we got from a big kind of listening exercise to our stakeholders when we were looking at reshaping the next stage of our sustainable living plan was, great, Unilever, brilliant that you've been leading the way, but the way forward has to be with more partners cross-sector. And I think we're very clear on that, so I would love to hear ideas on how that could happen.
Fantastic. Mark, Hina, do you feel that, sort of taking that question and slightly flipping on its head, do you feel that from a sort of an NGO perspective, you can help businesses to be more, to go through those sort of transformations, to be more impactful, to be more purposeful, and ever be potentially net positive? Do you want to go first?
Sure. My answer is yes, and I think the place to do it is, partner with NGOs where they can handle the subsidized portion of that transformation, right? That's their job, that's their bread and butter, that's what they're good at. So find the places that will help you transform, because the consumers and the voters are headed there. And so as a business, you are either, as an established business, you're either going to figure out how to pivot there, or someone else is going to beat you to it, right? You're Unilever and you figure out how to do it in a way that takes down P&G and fends off seventh generation, and all the others are going to beat you there eventually, right? And to me, the place to involve the NGO in that is to say, what are the places that I need to pivot and transform, but right now it's not I can't do that in a profitable way. Find NGOs who can do that, because that's their job, is to operate in that subsidized market and help get it to where it's profitable for you, and you can be that transformed organization.
Bold. Hina.
So I think Unilever bought seventh generation recently. So yeah, that's one way around it.
That's one way to do it too.
It's one of the ways of doing it.
Yeah, one way. Take over. So a couple of the conversations we've been having internally at WWF is actually around our role to help bring together business models and allow companies to have pre-competitive discussions. So in particular around the plastics space, there's an opportunity for NGOs there to actually encourage synchronization. So helping, for example, the likes of Unilever and P&G to make those circular economy changes to their products all at the same time. So it doesn't mean that one of them has to go alone or take on the brunt of the financial cost to make that change, or the risk that's associated with scaling innovation. So when it comes to that kind of transformation, I feel that the NGOs moving forward have a real opportunity to drive change across supply chains. But I will also counter that with the fact that there is a rise of the in-house sustainability teams. So obviously Unilever have been paving the way, but there are many others coming up behind who are actually undermining a lot of the work which traditionally corporate partnerships teams have done before. So the term fourth sector, I don't know if people have heard about it or not yet, but it's being bandied around as the new way to think about where we're moving. If you haven't heard of it, look it up later. But if we do head in that direction, then actually we move away from the traditional corporate charity, corporate NGO partnership altogether, and it will be more all about businesses driving purpose themselves from within. So it depends. I think it depends which way businesses are planning to go, and making sure that NGOs really still have some value to add in this space. Otherwise, we're going to move back to the transactional engagement.
Over here. We've got time for one more question. There it is, straight in front of you. Gentlemen. Oh, sorry. We'll take two. We'll take both. We can do it. Come on.
Okay. Well, so there was a sort of prompt to look at some dirty laundry, but I haven't heard any. It's like a
What do you want to know?
There's still a chance. But another point that hasn't come up a lot in the conversations has been necessary sometimes partnerships with government bodies. If we talk about supply chains, if we talk about West Africa, it is very much controlled in many cases, and often very hard, in my experience, to actually do something there. And it's just seeing if anyone has some experience there and stuff that has worked, has not worked, particularly to our focus of today, which is cocoa in West Africa.
Thank you. And sorry, the second question.
Thank you. I'm Paul Masick with the World Cocoa Foundation. I'd like to ask a question, and it's been somewhat ambiguous in this discussion. We seem to be using the term NGO interchangeably with social enterprises. However, I think in some ways they're fundamentally different. One is an enterprise business, another is a nonprofit entity set up for social or other purpose. I was wondering if you could share some best practices and thinking from your own perspectives on when and where large multinational companies should be thinking about making investments in social enterprises, partnerships with them, as opposed to what is the more traditional role of partnering with NGOs to implement projects and programs.
Thank you. So I'm going to roll these all together, and hopefully this is going to work seamlessly. Ready? On it? So we're going to ask your experience and advice in terms of partnering with governments, social enterprises, and one call to action to the audience.
Okay.
Can we do it all together?
Yeah, I'll have a crack at it. Thank you. Well, the government one, I think, coming back to the Transform example, we found that actually having a very shared vision for what we want to achieve together is actually the key to that. So I think the success criterion there is that starting from that position and not making assumptions about what each other's trying to get out of it is the key factor, and get past that, and with a lot of ongoing trust, not to be underestimated. You can work through the questions that come up, because I think recognizing that you're living in two very different environments where, in one case, probably one of the biggest issues that you have to deal with is a question in the House of Commons, although these days not many of them are any other topic.
Don't mention it.
So I didn't mention the word, I said
well
it.
Done.
but you know, that's one perspective, and ours, of course, you know, in a corporate world, are very different. You know, kind of, are we delivering for our consumers? And so, being able to have a common conversation about what we're trying to do together, I think, in that context, has been the key. And then, you know, we have, you know, Grace in the audience who works on Transform, who manages and navigates that process brilliantly. So having people on the ground who are working together at the coalface, if you like, is key. And the other piece was
social enterprises.
On social enterprises and the NGO question. I think for me it's horses for courses, and you know, the point about, you know, what's changing in the NGO environment. So why is that a surprise? You know, the world is evolving, and every organisation has to adapt to be competitive in its space. So I would be looking for NGOs to continue to add value where they can, based on their own skill base, their own legal structures, etc. And if they want to invest and they want to become kind of an enterprise on the ground, great. If they want to operate in a different way, great. You know, it is, for me, the question is what we're achieving together actually, have we got the right components in the room to get there? So I'm not too hung up on how NGOs are structured and what they're doing, as long as it's aligned to partnerships that work. But I think, you know, on the question of should companies be investing in social enterprises and these kind of early stage ventures, well, obviously I'm biased. I think that's the only way to experiment. And by doing it in partnership, you reduce risk, and therefore you can do more of it and you can do it faster.
Thank you. And a piece of advice for the audience, or a call to action?
My call to action was the one earlier, I think. It just, you know, I think it would be good to stretch ourselves to think about the cross-sector partnerships that could really move the needle on both. In my, you know, I'm interested in the business angle because I think that's the way to do it sustainably, but also obviously for the impact on the SDGs.
Thank you, Clive.
So, to the experience of partnering with government, I would say we probably have mixed experiences. Certainly in Europe and maybe North America, we see real challenges and perhaps at times a closing space in terms of opportunity for companies to partner. A learning from the business, it's not quite dirty laundry that was the request, but was we've had to go on a process of educating our business colleagues that there is no free money. You have to commit and you have to understand all that stuff we talked about earlier. And I think we've had a few cases where that's not been fully understood, and then there's a bit at the end of it in terms of match funding that's sat rather uncomfortably. So that's a process of learning we've been through. I think we've sought partnerships in a number of cases. We work at the moment with UNDP on a number of supply chain landscape or jurisdictional projects, because they're in countries where it's quite difficult for us to collaborate meaningfully with those governments, perhaps from the bias of the administrations, where the development agenda sits within the priorities for the government. And so as an organisation like UNDP, where frequently we're working with are hosted within ag ministries, and then can more legitimately share some of the concerns around the enabling environment. That's, you know, a route that partnership has been useful to help us move forward. In terms of the distinguishing between social enterprise and NGOs, I mean, we look at internally, you know, the types of organisations we're working with and what need we think we have. I think in the past we've fallen foul with not-for-profit service providers who want to advocate to us when we think we're procuring a service, and that's uncomfortable, and some of those are no longer working with us, and some of them are still working with us, and it's really quite difficult, and we're unwinding those at the moment. I think to Paul's question, wherever you are, I think you already know that, you know, there's an opportunity, particularly in cocoa sector and West Africa, but elsewhere, where in some cases it's a development intervention. It's a genuine NGO development role that's appropriate. In other cases, we've got groups of farmers, and some have land, some have that entrepreneurial capability, and it's where can you seek out and target the individuals with the drive, the passion, the ideas, who can maybe lead some of their local community members who maybe have some of the resources but don't have that same drive and energy. And so that's something that our cocoa business has thought about and does so in partnership with WCF and others. So we're clear on the distinction. I think for this session we were focused on NGOs in the broader sense. My
Call to action.
My call to action, quickly, is I said earlier that we, maybe it's just us, but I think generally suffer from there being so many partnerships. And I kind of, the experience I have is we have evolution without natural selection, and it's rare to hear someone like Hina say that you celebrate it, let it go. So I think my call to action is for our hosts and for the audience to continue identifying and celebrating the truly transformational, so that it makes it easier for us to let go and sunset the transactional that masquerades as the other. That would be really helpful. And if we can do that in a way that allows governments to recognise the positive role we can play, that also is valuable.
We'll try. Mark, you sit at that quasi space anyway.
I'm going to focus on the social enterprise question because Care for Social Ventures' whole job is to take philanthropic programs and convert them into social enterprises. And so the definition of social enterprises is pretty important to us. And the last time I Googled it, there were 38 definitions of social enterprise when I could go through and find them. So there's not a good industry definition. It's not like we've all agreed on it. But I can tell you what we work on is we say it's something that needs to be financially sustainable. And so for us, it's something that it's got to be, financially, it's got to be able to run forever eventually. It doesn't mean you're going to get there tomorrow, but in our timeline in the next 5 to 10 years, it's got to get there. So that's what a social enterprise is for us. In terms of if I'm a corporation, why do I care about it? I think about it for two reasons. One is to fund the transition of philanthropic work into social enterprises, because there's just not enough philanthropic capital in the world to get everything done that we want to do. There's $150 billion of aid and philanthropy a year globally. The UN has said we need somewhere between 2 and 4 trillion a year. So as a CSR funder, I would be interested in it to figure out how do we convert things that have been traditionally philanthropic dollars into financially self-sustaining, because there's just not enough philanthropic capital out there. And then as an operator in a business unit, as a brand manager, someone managing a profit and loss statement, I care about it because they can play in spaces that I can't quite at scale. So whether I'm sourcing from Target or I'm sourcing from Cargill or Unilever, they're at a nexus that NGOs may not quite be able to play at, but I, as a large corporation, may not be able to play at, and they can play a partnership role for me for that purpose too.
And your call to action, challenge to the audience?
Challenge to the audience would be for corporations to find NGO partners that can help them do the subsidized work to help them get things to a place that it doesn't need to be subsidized forever. And then the call to action for NGOs would be to take a close look at what you do. What are your resources? What are your assets and capabilities that would be valuable for corporations of work that you can do that can push subsidized work into the unsubsidized sector to make it scalable and sustainable?
Fantastic. Thank you very much, sir. Hina, last but very definitely not least.
Okay, I'm going to let social enterprise definition stay with you. Not going to add to that. So institutional funding, working with government. So I think biggest opportunity there through our partnerships is to access further funding to actually scale some of the work we're doing, practically speaking. And then secondly, it's around influencing governments at a local, national and a global level. That's where we can make most positive change. So it's that advocacy piece. That would be where I would focus energy when engaging with governments. And then my call to action. So coming back to my point from the beginning of the session, I think we just really need to drive forward, bringing together the social and environmental thinking around partnerships, be it in tripartite arrangements or be it through any other means. But I feel like if we don't do that, we're just duplicating efforts and not having maximum impact.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Brilliant audience, amazing panel. Thank you.